It is the 30th day of September 2014. I'm Kamene Goro, and many thanks for joining us on Ebru African News this afternoon. Now, we've got a whole lot lined up for you in terms of what's been happening in the world thus far, so let's hop straight to it. Our top story is in Kenya, where cabinet secretaries will now be required to appear in person to answer questions in special sittings pursuant to a new standing order passed recently by the National Assembly. Now, Tuesday has been set aside as the day where a maximum of 3 cabinet secretaries will be answering questions from members of parliament. Sam Gakunyi reports.
Parliamentary committees have been relieved of their duties of grilling cabinet secretaries on issues that concern the people in various dockets. When Parliament returns from recess on 14th October, Interior Cabinet Secretary Joseph Olelenku, Lands Minister Charity Ngilu and Education Secretary Jacob Kamene will lead the way in the new dispensation.
This is in compliance with that article that Cabinet Secretaries must make formal reports and presentation to Parliament. And I'm sure it will be very, very interesting. Tuesday morning, 10 to 1, will be the most interesting period and engagement between Parliament and government.
Speaker of the National Assembly, Justin MUTURI, says the request of statement at the committee level has resulted to more problems than solutions.
Everyone has issues they want to raise. A question is raised, you refer it to a committee chair. What mechanism does a committee have to come into your ministry, find out somebody is asking that there was somebody who was shot down and buried, and the committee chair comes and says, this is a very serious matter, concerns life, and we will go to the bottom of it. But the committee chair has no way of getting into what bottom.
The 2 provisions of the Constitution provides for cabinet secretaries to be accountable individually and collectively, and that the National Assembly deliberates on and resolves issues of concern to the people. Although the cabinet secretaries have welcomed the idea, they are concerned that this might consume more of their time.
And please factor in one thing. In this new dispensation, Mr. Speaker, we don't have assistant ministers. Where ministerial representation is required, the minister is going to go there, and there's only one minister in every department.
Majority Chief Whip KATOO MITITO says CSs should not be worried in comparison with ministers in the previous government.
This is also the time for cabinet secretaries to create a very good rapport and networking in terms of their agenda with the legislation.
The cabinet secretaries were invited for breakfast by Speaker of the National Assembly and were taken for a tour of what will be their new territory once Parliament returns from recess. Making statements on the floor of the House will now be the order of the day every Tuesday from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. But this might be a new window of showdown between the Senate and the National Assembly, and indeed a mediation is required to avoid duplication of roles. Reporting for Ebru Africa in the National Assembly, I'm Sam Gakunyi.
Still with Kenyan politics, the Senate Committee on Devolution has lashed out at the Council of Governors for making recommendations to dissolve Makueni County if the Assembly fails to reconcile. Now, led by Committee Chairperson Kipchumba Murkomen, the committee termed the governor's action as embarrassing and pledged to help reconcile the warring factions in the County Assembly. Now, the committee will meet various parties from the 14th of October in a 3-day inquiry meeting to try and resolve the crisis.
What is alarming the Senate is for us to hear from our counterparts who are working for the counties, particularly the county governors, announcing that a county should be suspended. If you read the County Government Act, Article 123, if you read the Constitution, Article 192, it was never anticipated or even contemplated or even imagined that a governor, a senator, or a county assembly member would even, and the president and the national government officials would imagine a suspension of a county government. That was never contemplated. What is contemplated in the law is that suspension would be as a result of war or conflict, which is not the case in Makueni yet, despite the fracas that we saw when the leaders were meeting.
The trial of South African opposition leader Julius Malema facing corruption charges has been postponed until next year. Now, an ANC youth leader, Malema himself is known for campaigning against corruption and focusing on the poor in South Africa.
If he is convicted, Malema will lose his seat in parliament, neatly solving the problem of how the government deals with these troublesome questions in the assembly at least. But President Jacob Zuma cannot be feeling too comfortable as he watches the law take its course and the fact that restless efforts to reinstate 700 charges of corruption against him have received fresh impetus. The charges were dropped shortly before he became president in 2009, allegedly because of interference in the prosecution case by his political opponents. But new details have emerged of how Zuma is said to have accepted a bribe from the French arms firm Thales by uttering the coded phrase, "I see the Eiffel Tower's lights are shining today."
He hasn't got any corruption. The problem is that political influence has made him to be seen as if he has got corruption. But we do support him because we don't see any corruption in him.
The government denies any wrongdoing. Now, the charges relate to a multi-billion-dollar arms deal signed in 1999, which has long haunted Zuma and other government officials alleged to have taken kickbacks.
We do feel that he is innocent, so when we are here, we want to give him a full support so that by tomorrow they release him, because we do feel what he's talking all the time is the truth.
However, in an indication of the breadth of the suspicions against the president, that is not the money that Malema was demanding that Zuma repay. He wants Zuma to cough up to $24 million of taxpayers' money spent on security upgrades at his rural home, enough to buy several mansions in Johannesburg or Cape Town.
Fighters from the IS have closed in on a key Kurdish town in Syria, right next to the border with Turkey, prompting the government in Ankara to deploy tanks to protect its territory. Now, the news comes as activists claimed that the U.S. warplanes that attacked ISIL in Syria killed at least 2 civilians, as well as an unknown number of rebel fighters.
The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the strikes hit mills and grain storage areas in the northern Syrian town of Manbij, in an area controlled by ISIL. Strikes on a building and on a road leading out of town also killed a number of ISL fighters. Amid the escalating IS violence, Turkey has deployed tanks and armored vehicles to reinforce its border with Syria, as parliament is set to consider whether to authorize military action against the fighters. The army moved tanks and armored vehicles to the border town of Mursit Pinar, which lies across the key Kurdish town of Ain al-Arab, after some stray bullets hit Turkish villages, sparking retaliation from Turkey's military under its rule of engagement. The government said on Monday it would shortly submit motions to parliament authorizing the armed forces to take action in Iraq and Syria so Ankara can join the US-led coalition against the IS fighters. Previously, Turkey had refused to join a broad and anti-IS coalition led by the United States, while dozens of its citizens, including diplomats' children, were being held by IS fighters, having been abducted from the Turkish consulate in the northern Iraq city of Mosul. Turkey has so far accepted over 160,000 Syrian refugees who fled the IS assault near the town of Ain al-Arab, and has called for the creation of a safe buffer zone to help civilians inside Syria.
Hong Kong protesters have refused to budge until Beijing agrees to free elections after tens of thousands turned the city's downtown into a carnival, with the US leading calls for authorities to show restraint after crowds were pelted with tear gas. Here's more on that story.
Tired but defiant, Hong Kong protesters celebrated getting through the night without fresh confrontation with riot police. They show no sign of backing down, digging in for a third day of occupying major thoroughfares. Schools in affected areas were again closed, and commuters faced disruption, with many bus routes suspended or rerouted and taxis scarce. The protesters have left Beijing grappling with one of the biggest ever challenges to its rule of the semi-autonomous city at a time when the Communist Party is cracking down hard on dissent on the mainland. The demonstrations, the worst civil unrest Hong Kong has experienced since its 1997 handover from British rule, were sparked by Beijing's decision last month to restrict those who can stand for the city's top post. The protesters want Beijing to give Hong Kong a free vote for its next leader, something Beijing has rejected. Over the weekend, police used tear gas and pepper spray, but the riot police have since withdrawn and protesters remain calm. The United States led international calls for Beijing's authorities to exercise restraint.
I can tell you that the U.S. government is closely watching the situation in Hong Kong. Around the world, this is true in Hong Kong and other places, the United States supports internationally recognized fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of peaceful assembly and the freedom of expression. The United States urges the Hong Kong authorities to exercise restraint and for protesters to express their views peacefully.
Communist authorities are worried that dealing too softly with the protesters could encourage wider demands for greater freedoms on the mainland.
Wrapping up our bulletin, a group of international cricketers set a new world record for the highest ever match by playing at the top of Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest mountain in Tanzania. Now, the players were raising funds for charities including cancer research and conservation charity Tusk Trust. A group of eccentric international cricketers on Friday set a new record for the highest ever match with a lung-busting effort at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro.
Ah, sweet.
The summit of Kilimanjaro has half the level of oxygen than land at sea level, doubling the energy needed for the match. Participants also ran the risk of acute mountain sickness and even potentially deadly pulmonary or cerebral edema, the flooding of the lungs or brain.
You kind of forget where you are for a moment because the game takes place, there's a quick single available, you've got to take that run. But then you get to the other end and it's only 22 yards, but you get to the other end and you're shattered, absolutely shattered. The oxygen levels are minimal to say the least up here.
The game was played at 5,730 meters in the dusty and icy crater just below the dormant volcano's 5,895 meter summit. The teams, including England's Ashes bowling legend Ashley Giles and South African icon Mkhaya Ntini, the country's first black test player, trekked to the roof of Africa before dawn and played 10 overs each of a 2020 game before clouds stopped the play.
Climbing Kili was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I'll never do it again, but it was one of the greatest life experiences you'll ever have or you'll ever do, and certainly will stay with me forever. Playing cricket up there was absolute madness, I can tell you. Aptly named Kili Madness.
The standing record for the world's highest game had been 5,165 meters, played in the Himalayas at Everest Base Camp in Nepal in 2009. A plastic track, stumps, bats, pads and plenty of spare balls were all hauled up by Tanzanian porters during a 7-day trek, and qualified umpires were on hand to ensure that the game was played properly and eligible for the record.
I have climbed Mountain Kilimanjaro for 15 years, taking 100 of tourists on top of Kilimanjaro. I didn't see it. But yesterday I see people from British, England, play cricket on top of Kilimanjaro. That was amazing.
The Gorillas team, led by England's women's vice-captain Heather Knight, scored 82-5 to beat Giles' Rhinos team, who managed 64-9. The players are raising funds for charities including cancer research and conservation charity Tusk Trust, which works to stem rampant poaching of elephants and other animals. The funds raised will also go towards building Rwanda's first international cricket pitch. Now, the game is growing rapidly in popularity in the Central African nation after being introduced by those who returned after fleeing a genocide 20 years ago. That wraps up all we had lined up for you on Ebru African News this afternoon. Make a date with Michelle Morgan later on this evening for our primetime bulletin and a more comprehensive outlook at what's happening in our world today. Now, we appreciate your feedback and your views, so please drop us an SMS on our SMS line at 21292, or you could catch us on our Facebook and Twitter page at Ebru Africa TV, at Ebru Africa News, and on Facebook, Ebru Africa TV. I'm Kamene Goro, and until next time, do have yourself one lovely, blessed afternoon.